Cool. Welcome, Steve, to the Civitas podcast. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time. Just to give you guys some context, I've known Steve for a couple of years. He was involved in one of the Igniter boot camps many years ago. And since then, we've crossed paths a couple of times. Currently, the last time I met with him was consulting with Edge Growth, helping them sort out all of their tech. And he's done that with a number of other SMEs, and I really respect him. So just to kick off, Steve, you want to just tell us a little bit about the business you run and the typical client and the nature of problems that you solve for those clients?
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul, and thanks for having me. Yeah, it's great to be here. So yes, as Paul mentioned, I've been through the journey. We've gone through, I went through Igniter many years ago, which is where we met. And my background, I'm actually a chartered accountant for my sins, but I've gone through multiple different iterations of my career. I like to sort of describe myself as an extreme generalist. And I started off as I did auditing. I eventually moved into recruitment, looked after the sort of national recruitment program for one of the big four accounting companies. I moved into strategy and management consulting. Then I learned to code and basically built a tech platform. And then that was actually how I met Paul. And then after that, I basically moved into more consulting. And that's kind of where I find myself now. And my business is Cadence on the Cloud, and we sort of specialize in basically solving tech problems for businesses. For the most part, I kind of use my sort of extreme generalist skill set, understanding business as a whole, and also my love for technology to basically go into businesses and help them place the right technology, make sure that they're getting the right information out of the right technology. And that's normally quite challenging. I find a lot of businesses do struggle trying to solve that problem because there's sort of there's a tool for every need, but never quite your need. And so that's really where I've specialized, trying to help customers or at least clients find the right technology and make them work.
Awesome. And then what sort of type, size companies do you work with, or is it industry specific? So generally, if they're coming to you, is it usually like a 50-person organization, a 5-person organization? Who's your ideal client?
Yeah. So my ideal client are sort of businesses that are normally between sort of, let's say 20 and 100 staff. And they're normally anywhere between, from a revenue side, anywhere from let's say 10 to 200 million rand revenue. That's kind of the position where businesses start to find that they have this need. They can't solve it themselves. They're not quite sure what to do with the technology. These kind of technology needs are sufficient enough that they need help getting it deployed, but don't necessarily have the internal technology specialization or skills to be able to do it by themselves.
So you're almost outsourced CTO, where you can come in and help them solve the technology issues. Okay, cool, awesome. So I think maybe what we can do is, because you've worked with businesses of all sizes, it might be interesting to talk a little bit around the tech journey, and just sort of as you're starting out, what would be sort of the first little bit of tech that you as a startup want to get in place?
Sure. So it's actually quite an interesting one. There's ultimately, I think everyone always leans towards like a cool CRM system or a cool project management system. But ultimately, there's basically two types of technologies I think every business needs to start with. The first is an accounting system. There's typically three in South Africa that we tend to use. It's Xero. It's Sage. Thank you, and QuickBooks. And so those are really the big three here. To be honest, the two biggest at the moment in my mind are actually Xero and QuickBooks, more sort of technology based, better APIs, things like that. So a good accounting system, because you don't want to get that wrong. And the second one is just having a really good, I call it sort of foundational, but it's pretty much it's your backbone. And that's depending on the type of technology that you typically use. That's going to be, Microsoft Suite. It's going to be Google Suite, or there's actually a third one in the play as well, which is Zoho. And they're all kind of what they provide. And the reason I say it's backbone is they typically provide your spreadsheet, your document solutions, your email hosting, typically some kind of team chat platform. And it's sort of an all-in-one kind of solution where I can basically stitch things together and deliver whatever I need to, a Word document, a proposal. I can, I can do my invoicing. I can do all those kind of things. And it sets the foundation for everything that you need to do.
Well, and then sort of the interesting things around a number of the guys then manage to have get a whole bunch of other tools after that. So what tends to happen is then sort of it looks at like a bit of a project management, or they basically got a whole bunch of different providers. And some of the guys in the community have argued that rather you just want to go for like a single provider that has all of that stuff, as opposed to the best of a number of those. So like the practical example is that we've had one or two founders where they just go, we're going all Microsoft, where other founders will have Zoom, Slack, Google Suite, all of those. So what's your take on sort of like a single tool versus many different tools?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I find, especially when businesses start to get to this size, you start to wrestle with that exact problem. So as I mentioned earlier, the reason I've actually found my niche is because there are so many tools out there. There are literally hundreds of tools. And it's because there's always a tool trying to solve a niche. And in my experience, I've never found a business that has the perfect need for the perfect tool. You're lucky if you get away with like between 60 and 80% of your kind of need is solved with a single tool. Where you find certain markets have done really well, Zoho, I mentioned earlier, is a great example. They do everything. You can go for like a Zoho One subscription and you've got like 50 plus enterprise level tools at your fingers. And that's like 2 different project management tools and a CRM tool and everything else. Now, that's great if you can take the time to kind of integrate them. But even then, the integrations are limited. It becomes quite hard to stitch them together. So ultimately, depending on the size of your business, what you're actually looking for is a tool that solves your specific need the best, right? So the best part to really start off, and I find, once you've got those kind of foundational tools, you'll typically look at a project management tool and a CRM. Those are typically the 2 big ones that normally come in. Where you've got sort of big, long sales processes, a CRM is probably better. You can invest time in kind of making sure that lead is engaged, and you've got to kind of keep them in tow for, between 6 and 9 months to kind of get that sale done. And the CRM makes a lot of sense versus a project management tool where you're starting to look at, I need to make sure that I'm delivering right. Now, the question is, do these need to speak to each other? And I would argue, no, they don't need to. The real question is, and we're actually in an awesome age now with tools like Power BI, and there's this buzz around business intelligence. And ultimately, I think what the misconception is here, and we talk about the digital age and this fourth industrial revolution, which is a weird buzzword to me still, because I don't think it's completely understood. People want their tools to work together. And I think what they really want to do is, it's not about getting the tools to work together. It's about getting powerful insights from multiple disparate data sources and being able to draw interesting insights from these different data sources. And I think that's ultimately the goal is, it's nice to have the tools speak to each other, but if you want the tools speaking to each other, you need to maintain that relationship. And that gets quite hard. Are these APIs speaking together? Are they integrating well? I can give you an example of a really a terrible integration. Let's take something like, an Airtable or any one of these form tools. For anyone who's used it before, Airtable is a fantastic database tool. It's kind of like a SQL database with an Excel front end. So it's really easy to use, but it works with a relational database backend. The evolution I typically see people do is they've implemented Airtable in their business and they want a form tool to be able to do complex forming. Now, this tool has a number of integrations where you can link form tools to Airtable. The integration is terrible because it is so restrictive in what you can do. Now, that's a great example of, I can integrate these two. They can speak to each other. But ultimately, it's so restrictive, the type of integration between, that you're actually better off using something like a Zapier and just stitching the thing together yourself rather than using the nice integration between the two. And so, my advice to businesses is find the tool that solves your need, and the stitching of data together you can do, you'll work around that. You'll use things like, Power BI is a phenomenal tool, Tableau as well. Zoho Reports is another way. I think it's called Zoho Analytics now. We're able to stitch multiple data sources together and actually start deriving those insights. But actually just finding, especially when you start getting the businesses and you've got sort of 50 people, it's more important that you've kind of got all of the people in your organization having a pleasant user experience in that front end. Is it doing exactly what I need? And then you worry about okay, cool, how am I going to get the data out of the system and make sure that I'm stitching it together with other tools? Project management with your finances. If you're using timesheets, how are you linking your payroll records, your timesheet data, your financial data, and how are you starting to get that kind of insight? That's really what I feel businesses want. And having a tool that kind of plays nicely with everything else actually just ties them into a bigger commitment down the line, because then it means that two major tools in your organization, you can't replace either of them because they work so nicely together. You're almost better just making sure that each tool does what it's supposed to, and then you build a nice environment in the background where those tools are working together and you're getting data from these sources.
And then on selecting tools, is there anything that you want to look out to make sure that tools can integrate versus not integrate? And how would you assess a tool around that?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think the thing I normally look for is does it have a RESTful API? So what you're looking for is does it have an API that you can actually access? And the minute you've got that, you can actually stitch that into Power BI. And it's really straightforward. You enter in the URL, you put in a sort of an identifying parameter, and you can just sync your data in real time directly to the dashboard. And then from that workspace, you can basically build your own dashboards, your own reports, everything else you need. And so long
and
as
then on the API selection, if they've got a REST API, is that good enough, or are there sort of different caliber of APIs that would?
No, for the most part, that's pretty much sufficient. In my experience, that's been fine. The only tool that's actually been a little bit challenging, for example, something like Xero is something that's got the API, it's got all of that, but you actually use almost like a third party, not a third party, but like a pre-built solution to integrate. And once again, these things are pre-built. You can just tie in your Xero data directly to it. It works well.
Steve, what are the common issues we've been having, and I don't know if you have the answer offhand, is around basically like company handbook and documentation tools. I don't know if there are any obvious recommendations there. A number of people have sort of just gone with Google Docs. Other people have tried things like Notion, but they sort of complain about the search not being up to scratch. Some guys are fiddling around with Coda, Outline. So I don't know if you've got any like obvious one there around company handbooks or company wikis.
Yeah, and again, I mean, there's some really great tools out there. So I think keeping your company handbook in your sort of foundational data, I think it's a good start. And I would probably recommend it because you're not worrying about moving the tech around. Some other options that you can look at, things like, if you've ever heard of Basecamp, Basecamp is a really nice communication and collaboration tool. And that's almost for me the next part that you could keep information like that. I feel like handbook data specifically, and because it's so closely tied actually to your company culture, you actually want it. It's cool to keep it in your sort of foundational, keep it in a folder somewhere. But I mean, ultimately, you want people referring to it. And I think if people are referring to it, you actually want it closer to your sense of community. So it's maybe a little bit unorthodox, but actually I would start to put stuff like that into, if you're using Slack as a communication channel, put it in, have a Slack channel with your handbook people can refer to. It's typically got powerful search because it's effectively searching text. You can categorize things by sort of chat discussions. It's an unusual way, but ultimately what you're doing is you're trying to, specifically with handbook and culture and values and things like that, you actually want it at people's fingertips. And so it feels like, I feel the way we're moving forward is less about document storage and more about information storage. How do we make that information accessible to people?
Okay, cool. And then what's your take, Stephen, a little bit around custom software versus tools? So should I be building this myself? Or should I be basically just bringing in a tool to do it? And how do you make that decision around, should I custom build it or should I basically be using a tool?
Yeah, and again, it's a great question. So it depends on the nature of the tool, right? What I would say, often the discussion for should I build it or effectively what you're doing, this is actually a build or rent discussion. When you're paying a subscription fee, you're effectively renting that service from someone else. The big thing I think people normally forget about is you say, oh, I can build this myself for insert price here. But the problem is, could you maintain it? Technology changed quite rapidly. especially if you're going to custom build something, and when you talk about that, are we building a custom SaaS solution for our organization to use? I would say typically the answer is rented. As much as possible, you actually want someone else to build and maintain and let them have the headaches. Because what protects you is that SLA. Effectively, when you're using that tool, it's their problem to make sure they're delivering the service in line with your agreement. Where the one area I would say that there is a motivation for building is if you start to look at things like a lot of these backbone services. We mentioned Microsoft, we mentioned Google, we mentioned Zoho. They have what's effectively an app builder. And so what the app builder is you've got a database in the background, and the database can be something like a spreadsheet. If we're looking at Microsoft, they've got effectively their Power Apps. You can have a list. Microsoft has got their own kind of, let's call it an Airtable competitor, but it's loosely so. But it effectively acts as a relational database in the background, and you can quickly throw together effectively a user skin, and it functions like an app. Where you've got a decent user interface for people to work with it. And now, when it comes down to that for me is a middle ground. You're not actually building anything too significant. You've got something like Microsoft who are actually maintaining all the technology in that, and you're basically keeping it running. In which case, I think the motivation for that is actually quite strong. You start to look at things like, maybe you're building, maybe your business is at a size you need to start worrying about risks. Now, you'd want to try and build a risk register that isn't an Excel spreadsheet. Then I think the motivation for having something like a Power Apps, where you're just stitching something together where you've got a database, you want to protect the database and restrict what people can do. You build effectively a Power App front end to that, so that your users have a nice way to do it without dealing with effectively what looks like a spreadsheet. And you get the best of both worlds for minimal effort. And so I think it's a really nice sort of time to be doing this kind of stuff. And there's a lot more technology available to us to be able to do that.
Cool, man. And then Steve, another question that comes up a little bit is like, how do you actually go from sort of the shopping list of tools to sort of selection? So I have a need. Okay, I've got a CRM. I need. How do I decide which one to go with? Are there any sort of quick hacks that you could suggest that would help people cut this process? Because sometimes it just feels like you can look at these tools and reviews online forever, and you're unsure sort of whether you're making the right decision.
Yes, that's always the hardest question, right? So yeah, you nailed the term right. The way I use it as well is a shopping list. And so, I mean, my normal approach to doing any kind of tech, and I mean, I've looked at hundreds of tools from CRMs to expense claim tools, financial systems, the works. And my approach is always very similar. And it starts off with developing what is a shopping list. And what I do is on that list, I effectively categorize items into needs and wants, right? There are things that are absolute must-haves that whatever tool we pick has to be able to deliver on. And then the other side is effectively a want. It's things that would be really nice to have, but if we don't have it, then we're actually just weighing up these tools. So what I typically do, an approach is, I would go and Google and say, I'm looking for a tool that does X, Y, and Z. And I would just write down a list of what these tools are. And you may get sort of 10 or 20 of them. And then what you do is you basically go through them, and actually the pricing documentation is actually the best place to start, because it's normally got a really nice feature of a list of features. And just have a read through them. And you start to build up a sort of understanding about what these tools can do. If we're starting looking at project management tools, you're looking at sort of traditional project management tools with Gantt charts and things like that. Or maybe you're looking at something that's more Kanban or agile focused. You start to understand what these kind of tools can do. Once you've got that initial understanding, you can then look at your scenario and say, okay, cool. Like, of all the things I've seen, what do I like? And you effectively list everything that you like. And you say, these are the 20 things that I really liked from these tools and I needed to be able to do. And then you get critical and you say, all right, from all of these things I've listed, what are deal breakers and what are, just nice to haves? And once you've got that, like, that's the best starting point. Then you can go to your list. Personally, I would take typically 5 tools, and then I would just do some desktop research to say which of these tools can do which of these features. Then you're looking at effectively the price point. And often these tools, you've typically got, all these tools sort of priced in 3 buckets, right? You've got entry level, super cheap, or open source. You've then got your medium price, which conforms to pretty much standard pricing. These are pretty much your pro plans. And they're, for project management tools, you're probably looking at sort of anywhere between $15 and $20 a user a month. For CRM tools, maybe looking at about $25 a user a month. And so, sort of pricing those sort of generic fee, the sort of standard plans, and then you've got the enterprise. And the enterprise is I'd say 99% of the time request a quote. And so we kind of leave the enterprise for the meantime. Most organizations, you're pretty much happy with a pro plan. And so, however they choose to name it, it's typically around about the middle ground, and it's about the $20 to $25 price point for most tools, actually. And once you've got that, you're effectively measuring the tools, the 5 or 6 tools that you're looking at against effectively your shopping list. And then you're normally able to sort of, make a fairly good guess then. You landed sort of 1 to 2 decent tools that you want to test. You can register accounts and then actually have a play around with the tools and see what sort of speaks to you and your team. And absolutely get parts of your organization involved in that testing phase. So bring 5 or 6 users from your organization who are sort of tech savvy or working in the space, get them to play around with the tools that you've shortlisted, typically around 2 tools, get them to play around with them, almost get them to almost make the recommendation, say, well, actually, we really like this tool. Great, you've got buy-in with the sort of the people that are really matter, that really going to use this tool. And then you're able to go forward and sort of roll it out.
Awesome. And Steve, I think that's a pretty comprehensive answer. I think that the next one is to just go back, maybe to wrap up, as you spoke a little bit about data and analytics and the importance of tools being able to integrate. So a lot of the members in the community, some of the stuff that they struggle with is dashboards, what should be on the dashboard, and then the process to selecting the software and then integrating around that. So I'd just be very interested around sort of your view at when you should start looking at setting up dashboards. What kind of dashboard should you be looking at? And when should it be basically like what's sort of the basic level housekeeping stuff versus sort of proactive insights? So I'd imagine there's a more sophisticated answer.
Yes. So again, it's one thing I actually want to tag onto that as well. And I find a lot of organizations, when they're looking at these they're starting to look at trying to understand data. I think the biggest pitfall that they have is they start to use Excel as a database in many cases. So what happens is you've got, let's call it, you've got your financial system. And the question is, where is the truth, right? So let's talk about financial systems. So, for example, your business is using Xero, right? Great. So your financial information, Xero is the truth of your organization. You've maybe got a project management tool. Great. That's the truth. There's Asana. You're using it for project management, and maybe a CRM tool. But then you've got a whole bunch of other things. Maybe you've got a staff list. Maybe you've got some workings you did with your forecasts, or whatever the case is. And a lot of these data pieces start to sit in things like Excel. And that's the first challenge, is you've got all these different data sets and they're all over the place, right? So now you need to start stitching these together. So depending on the backbone that you're using. So for example, if all the users in your organization are using Windows computers, great, you've most likely gone for Microsoft backend, in which case you've got access to something like Power BI. Power BI doesn't work on Macs. You've got to, to be able to use the desktop app, you've got to use it on a Windows machine. So let's say that's your organization, and that's quite a number of them. You can effectively start stitching this data together through something like a Power BI. And so, one thing I would do is that does take a little bit of learning, but also you can get stuck in this kind of design phase where to the exact question you raised is, what do I need this dashboard to be able to tell me? Like, what insights I'm actually looking for? The best thing I can actually say for that is to actually build out and mock out reports in Excel. It's so much quicker. You're probably working with it already, and you start to get a view on what is important or what is informative to me to be able to make decisions. Once you start to sort of play around with that, you actually start to get a sense of like what's important data to you, so that when you use something like a Power BI, you can autonomously bring this data in, and you can connect it to things like spreadsheets. You can start moving your data to things like lists, but then connect directly to these tools, and then you can start syncing that data. The actual question around the dashboards, how frequently you should be looking at the data, things like that. To be honest, it depends on the situation. Sometimes you need more relevant data, and I think in those cases you're going to be looking to sync data more frequently. But I think the big thing that people should be looking for, if you're concerned around dashboards and what I should be learning about, you should also be looking simultaneously at like, where is my data stored? Because if you're starting to have version control issues and things like that, which is what normally happens, you start to, the worst thing you'll always see is someone sends you an Excel file and they're like, this is the latest version, and it's called like version 3 final, and you immediately know like there's going to be a version control problem here. This data is kind of sitting all over the place. And so I feel like before businesses can really have a good stab at like what a dashboard needs to do and what it needs to tell me, you need to make sure that your data is in a good spot. Because if you, doesn't matter how sexy your database or how sexy your dashboard is, if the data feeding that is wrong, that it's going to be useless. And so in terms of priorities, if you want to start looking at databases, dashboards, you need to make sure that your data is stored in decent places. And then once you're happy that your data is being stored and maintained and you know where the truth is, you can then look at the dashboard and then start building out a story that makes sense to you and tells you the important insights that you need.
Awesome. And Steve, so if someone would like to get hold of you, how could they go about? Where would you suggest they reach out?
Yeah, perfect. So my email address is Stephen at cadence.co.za. That's Stephen with a PH at cadence.co.za. They can drop me a mail, and I'm always happy to discuss. And the needs are typically solved are sort of unstructured problems that people actually don't know how to solve. So I'm always happy to have a chat and sort of discuss these problems with people and figure out a way forward and see if I can help them.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Fantastic. Thank you.